So yeah, delighted that you can join us today, Chiko, as Research Fellow in Health and Built Environments in the School of Built Environments at Brookes. It's a pleasure to have you here to tell us about your research. So yeah, without further ado, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. And hello to everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I hope you can hear and see me okay. And so I will today take you through what will be quite a conversational presentation concerning the infrastructures of care for and by older people in the global South. So initially, my interest in infrastructures of care for older people in this particular context grew from the fact that I tried to come to terms with the specific meanings of inclusive design. So my background is that I studied architecture and inclusive urban planning. I conducted my PhD at the Surface Inclusive Design Research Centre, that's in Manchester. And so my area was inclusive design prior to actually going into inclusive urban aging. And so how I came into infrastructures of care was really starting to understand inclusive urbanity. So the urban environment, how that can be inclusive in the global South context. And I was working at the time in 2014 with Manchester City Council, and they'd started this age-friendly city and community initiative in Manchester, and that was spreading to Salford and Greater Manchester, and just working in the group on that. And so I started to really interrogate theoretically and also more practically how we design age-friendly cities. But I was also more interested in the age-friendly city framework within the global South context. And many of you are obviously very familiar with the World Health Organization Age-Friendly City Network. I think back when I was investigating it and started being more interested in it, it was about 500 members, so it's growing. And you know that this framework that was designed was emphasized this relationship between health, between the built, the natural, and the social environment, as well as the role of multiple stakeholders, particularly local government, in creating and enabling and empowering environments for older people. But also emphasizing older persons as critical users within the urban design, within the urban environment, and trying to emphasize this dimensions of diversity. And so age friendliness really started to develop into a very recognized and established, internationally recognized and established concept. And when I started to think about age friendliness in the context of some of the cities that I was starting to research in the global South context, it was apparent that a lot of the age-friendly communities that were committing to this framework that was starting to be created and developed were happening outside of a lot of the areas that I was interested in terms of research within the global South. And this is a very recent image that I took yesterday from the website, which shows the network. And it's so apparent in terms of the absence of commitment, particularly to this framework, not necessarily that nothing age-friendly is happening, but in terms of the commitment to this internationally recognized concept, that sub-Saharan Africa is, Africa, not just the sub-Saharan, is completely absent from this. And this was the case in 2014, so not much has changed between 2014 and 2022. And then also prior, when I started, there wasn't anything in South America, and also sort of the Middle East. And so we see sort of some movement there, but very little in comparison to the hotspots and the key areas. And of course, those that are experiencing areas that are experiencing sort of demographic transitions and changes at a much faster pace than a lot of the younger areas in the global South. And so Discourse on Africa in particular, which I'm going to be looking at, just talking about, has been happening. It is discourse on older people and sort of age-friendly centered sort of research work in particularly urban areas has been happening, although at a much slower pace, and really driven by international organizations such as HelpAge, the World Health Organization, etc., and a small corpus of African researchers or those that are interested in the African region and sort of the urban region, but that's it is growing. For example, there is a recent network that was created recently on the care for older persons in Southern Africa, created by sort of Manchester, and the collaborations with other Southern African networks, and also a recent sort of consortium that has been started in West and East Africa on aging. So it is starting to gain some traction, but it's very slow, and this is also quite concerning, especially when we think about the statistics. Although proportionally, these regions will remain quite young, but the absolute numbers are growing, and a lot of that is happening in urban areas. So the background, this kind of background and these questions and this sort of apparent gap of activity and traction within these areas in terms of age friendliness, and particularly in urban areas, really set the tone for my research and interest in urban infrastructures of care for older people. And I started to attempt to understand aging within the urban scapes of the global South. How can we understand this concept of age friendliness in this context? How do older urban residents unfold and generate and live in these urban spaces? I mean, one can't deny, when we look at the World Health Organization framework, and age friendliness is very much focused on physical infrastructure, material infrastructure, but also sort of the formal social infrastructures, etc. And so it was starting to really just question and feed this curiosity into how cities in the global South can be defined in places where formal urban planning and architecture have been almost non-existent, and where the remaining material infrastructures, certainly public ones such as water supply, electricity, road infrastructures, public buildings, are mainly present in their absence, or better, their functionings are more often than not punctuated by constant breakdown, or by lack, or by paucity, failure, and fragmentation, and this element of sort of recycling and repair. So looking into actually what does age friendliness look like? What are the lived experiences of older people within these urban settings? How do these areas maybe generate many shortcomings and impossibilities that may not fit into this global concept of age friendliness, which is very much made and designed from the global North? But what kind of different opportunities, different types of spaces, different types of age friendliness can be created where older people become sort of these subjects of query and investigate in urban aging? And take one example where sort of potholes or pools of water on public roads give way for infrastructural elements in themselves, and they create these thickenings of publics and offer the possibilities of assembling people or slowing them down so that one might actually sell something along the road, like this older man. And what are in the image here, and what are these sort of vulnerable and invisible infrastructures that impose a different way of creating a city, of understanding a city, and the age friendliness beyond maybe the guidelines that are so often encouraged. So it was sort of looking at how, beyond maybe what I had started to understand as a researcher. In my work in Manchester, and we see here some of the work done on sort of the Metrolink station and the tram stops, and then a very sort of pivotal project that sort of started the age friendliness, which was on an old moat project where older residents, this is in Manchester, where older residents really claimed really emphasized the importance of seating, formal benches and seating and rest spaces, and this kind of really well-defined public spaces within their community and their neighborhood. And so it forced me to look at actually how do we go beyond some of these solutions that may not be relevant in some of the contexts within the global South, and can there still be inclusive design in an urbanity which exists sort of beyond the material, but like in an immaterial structure or forms of sociability that exists in this sort of collective social imagination. So as a theory, I also started to gain more interest in the feminist ethics of care, which was sort of beyond the propensity of humans to care for those within their proximity, but looking at sort of recent scholars on care, on ethics of care, who conceptualize it as this everyday ethical practice. So to advocate this attentiveness and responsiveness to place specificities. So Tronto is a very sort of key researcher in this area of ethics of care, and looking at everything that we do. Care is everything that we do to maintain, continue, repair our world. So looking at this sort of everyday practices and everyday possibilities, and how sort of care and bringing these two rubrics of analysis of care and infrastructure could bring about maybe a way to understand age friendliness, but also the lived experiences of older people within urban areas that are complex and have sort of entangled elements to them. So I will look at sort of two cases, two aspects of research that I conducted and I was a part of, to not necessarily offer a well-structured statement and to answer some of the questions that I've just posed, but really to formulate some ideas and suggestions, and in ways that maybe can sort of trigger any kind of conversation after this on infrastructures of care and ways to explore and research. It's very much an ongoing journey for me in trying to understand how to actually be authentic to this sort of research area, and the kinds of questions that I've been exploring and unpicking on urban aging. So I use two examples of research that's bringing to light, some key older persons who are on the margins in these areas, so minoritized and marginalized older people, to kind of understand their lived experiences, but also how they navigate some of the infrastructures that they are part of. So the first cases I look at is part of a project which started in 2019. Initially, it was meant to be 2018, but 2019, and it's gone on until sort of this year. It will be finishing at the end of this year. And it's on inclusive housing infrastructure in the Albaca refugee camp in Jordan. And I started this project as a postdoc, so after I finished my PhD in 2018. And I joined this project, which is funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Newton Fund, but also the Industrial Partnership Fund. And there are multiple sort of stakeholders and researchers on this project from different UK organizations and also Jordan organizations. And it linked to other projects as well that were happening on kind of participatory digital technologies within this refugee camp, and also within other urban areas in Amman and Assault. in Jordan, but I'll just focus really on some aspects of this particular project. So this project examined the Albaca Camp as a key focus, and this camp is the largest in Jordan. It's located approximately 20 kilometers north of Amman, the capital city of Jordan. And as a camp, it's actually one of the most longest standing camps, having been set up in 1968 to accommodate mostly Palestinian refugees and displaced people who left the West Bank and Gaza Strip as a result of the 1967 Arab-Israeli war. And so at present, I think there are no exact figures, but it's over 100,000 from what the UNRWA projects. It's over 100,000 Palestinian refugees are currently living within this camp. So the camp has evolved considerably since its conception. It started as a defined plot of land with relief tents that you can see here. And so it was actually very formally organized according to the guidelines that existed there for sort of setting up refugee camps, the UN guidelines for that. And so it started with actually definition, formality, key specific infrastructure to support that, key types of housing, such as through these relief tents, and a way to kind of evolve in a temporary setting. And today, what sort of exists is this hybrid of temporariness. And we see here sort of some of the elements that I mentioned of formality. So there's this sort of evolution of types of housing, from relief tents to prefabricated shelters. And also we see that it was developed, the area that the Albaca refugee camp in is actually the experiences quite harsh climates, in such that it experiences a very, very harsh winter and a very, very harsh summer. So very extreme ends. And so that was this sort of climatic elements really sort of influenced the experiences of refugees as they sort of lived and settled here. And as part of the project, we conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews on families. Part of it was sort of focusing on older persons in the households that they lived in and the families that they were a part of, and also sort of interviewing their families, going into their homes and trying to really understand the housing setup and how really refugees were navigating and appropriating this sort of spatial, domestic spatial space, and also the community of this refugee camp. And so the refugee camp, Albaca refugee camp, is a place where, from these findings, we found that older refugees were experiencing every day, so social practices and self-organization. So, and that influenced their spatiality. And these practices evolved from kind of this denial of actually wanting to settle within this camp, or realizing that they were actually going to age in this camp, sort of aging being this kind of surprising element, because they always sort of held on to this promise of going back home and being able to just be here temporarily and leave and go back home, to some who had left family there, husbands there, and not wanting to really sort of grow as a family and embed within the Jordanian cultural context. So realizing that actually it came a point as individuals and individual older persons and their households and their families, that actually that the temporariness was evolving into this state of permanence. And so they began to experience these kind of sort of everyday social practices, self-organization, because the camp in itself wasn't designed for this permanence. Again, this sort of surprising element of evolution to permanence actually was not just for the residents, for the refugees, but also for those who, for the UN, for the country and also for those who had sort of designed this refugee camp. And so a lot of the infrastructure was set up, with this temporariness, and these sort of prefabricated shelters were set up to be temporary. And so the practices that we found that older people were experiencing, so were transforming, and a key practice was this element of kind of social practice, collective meeting, which the housing didn't really cater for. And so they would sort of instigate this element, and we spoke to older persons who were 50 years and over, and in some cases were heads of households, in some cases were part of the households of their family, of their children, who then sort of eventually became heads of households. But they played sort of a key role in instigating these sort of social gathering spaces to kind of mimic and reflect the spaces that they grew up in, because their children, for example, didn't really know those spaces. They were born in this refugee camp, or maybe came to the refugee camp when they were younger. And so they had all these memories, and it was really about trying to start to design their house and their space in a way that catered for the practices and the everyday practices that they would do, and that they would do in Palestine, to try and sort of as a form of care, and caring for themselves and also caring for their families. And so the housing that eventually was allowed was by the UN, didn't have sufficient space for these social gatherings. So they started to kind of go beyond these spaces and create these outdoor spatial social areas for collective meetings that carried this significance. And they emphasized how important it was to have this social bonding and critical bonding spaces for meeting together. And they needed to create these places sort of outside, because that was what was familiar to them, having this sort of indoor-outdoor areas. And this in itself was a type of violation, spatial violation, because according to the regulations, the homes that they built that they could only build could not be extended beyond the particular allocated grid. Of 96 to 120 square meters. But this desire and need to have these social practices as part of this sort of memory making led to these architectural elements, where they would create these elements beyond kind of their house for meeting together, but also for privacy. So a lot of older women spoke on how they didn't have any private spaces, private entrances, and so they would extend their home onto the public pavement, and some also kind of decorate it. And we see here some of the roof terraces that they created as part of, again, they were sort of types of spatial violations, but because of this sort of need to create spaces for collective gathering, that was really important to them. And in these spaces were also semi sort of political spaces, because as they sort of created these spaces and opened up for types of events where people would remember home and think about home, it started becoming a space of collective identity, but also gatherings for political planning and mobilization. And so these vertical terraces sort of evolved into spaces of thinking about the collective desire to return home, and also encouraging sort of ways of thinking, such as how to expand and grow as a community, so that they sort of create this mass return to Palestine. And this way of caring for each other in a way that they could move out eventually and return back home, but also settle here whilst they're planning that. So there was a lot of temporariness and but also establishing types of collective identity within this place. And so you found that sort of older people weren't quite, or the people that we interviewed were quite crucial to this type of social mobilization because of their memories, because of the types of ideas that they could bring that reflected their culture and community back home. And so played quite a crucial role in designing these spaces, and also from a physical point of view, but also from a social point of view. And so this space really allowed this interrogation of care and how caring for self, but also caring for an entire community can be done in a physical way, and how that sort of physical infrastructure and some of the violations that I'm mentioning, and I say that in beyond kind of the regulations, impacted the social infrastructure and ways for that, so that they could sort of care for each other and for themselves. And I'll just move on briefly to the second case, which was taken from, and I'll mention sort of aspects of this, which is part of one aspect of my PhD, which focused on age-friendly informal settlements. And the area that I'll talk about is in Harare, in the city of Harare, which is the capital city in Zimbabwe. And I'll look at particularly older migrants living in these informal settlements, older international migrants. So as part of this project, this was a collaboration with the Slum Dwellers International, and also the Dialogue on Shelter, the Homeless People's Federation in the country, in Zimbabwe. And it was about looking at types of age friendliness, what that means within areas of informality. So for people who were experiencing internal displacement, and what that meant for them, and how they were navigating the physical and the social and cultural and political infrastructures. So I'll just talk a little bit about older migrants who migrated into Zimbabwe, and mostly from neighboring African countries, because their type of care and the way they cared for each other is also sort of located in the colonial and political histories of Zimbabwe. So infrastructure is a good analytical tool here, because that allows the sort of understanding of spatial, human, material, and institutional mechanisms of support and of care beyond just material infrastructure. So the research that I conducted was looking at particularly the interplay of informal settlements. And for older migrants, over the past 40 years, immigration to Zimbabwe experienced a considerable shift. During colonial times, Zimbabwe was a major destination country in the Southern African region. So we had migrants coming from the United Kingdom, the rest of Europe, to settle permanently in the country. And also migrants from neighboring countries such as Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, Namibia. And they were recruited primarily to work in mines, commercial farms, and in domestic service. And before the independence in 1980, Zimbabwe was characterized by limited options for Black people. So the colonialism depleted rural communities through the sort of rural to urban migration of able-bodied labor. So all the attempts to provide financial security for urban workers upon retirement were resisted by diverse groups on an assumption that African workers were only temporary migrants into town, so they'd only come to work as allowed and return back into sort of the rural life. And so urban life was viewed as this kind of preserve only for white people, mainly from sort of as part of the British colony and sort of other Europeans, and with Black Africans expected to return to their rural homes to live there, and that was their space of permanence. And for older people, that was the space of retirement. And so workers from Malawi, the neighboring countries I mentioned, Malawi, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, they were employed on farms and domestic service within sort of the urban areas, and particularly within the big cities like Harare and other cities like Bulawayo. They were employed on these cities, but they didn't, unlike other sort of Black Zimbabweans, they didn't have a rural home really to go back to. So they lived in this kind of limbo where so Zimbabweans would work in the city and go back into their rural homes. They didn't. And currently there is this sort of crisis of care for older people, particularly these older migrants, because there has been this urban carelessness of informality with the key groups, key political groups destroying informal settlements where older migrants had set up because they couldn't actually return back into rural areas. And so part of the project that I looked at was to just identify kind of the older migrants living in specific informal settlements that had set up because of this this unavailability of a place to go back and wanting to maintain their employment and not having sort of a rural area within the country. And kind of the precarious conditions of that informality. So this image here quickly just shows you two different informal settlements, Gun Hill and the Sekwa extension, but also there are multiple different informal settlements within the city of Harare. And the older migrants in this area, this is an image of the Gun Hill settlement, where the majority of older people here were older migrants from the neighboring countries that I mentioned. And this informal settlement was set up on private land or land that's contested. And so because of this contestation, the police would come and regularly and conduct evictions and raids. And so these older migrants would have to develop, build their houses, the thatched houses, and tear them down constantly and rebuild and tear them down constantly. And because they just did not have a larger family network and larger support network, their only option was really to hide after the police would come and to then return back to this area. Because for most of them, they were working in domestic services. And you see here towards like the periphery of this image, this settlement actually is in quite a wealthy area, wealthy suburban area, with kind of the mayor's house actually very close to there, overlooking this particular informal settlement. So the types of care, for example, in this informal settlement showed older migrants sort of living alone, some living in very, very small family structures. And again, it's reminding that this is in an urban area, it's in a capital city, but also living in areas that had this kind of rurality and rural infrastructures. And we see also that elements where housing and developing and building a house for themselves was really important and was part of a major major aspect of building care and building housing to care for themselves, but also to care for their family. And in these informal settlements, in collaboration with Slum Dwellers International, there was a Bill and Melinda Gates Fund which funded this sort of upgrading of these informal settlements. And we see where older migrants were sort of leading in the co-production and the development and the building of these houses for themselves, and how important it was to provide this type of care and this type of housing infrastructure for themselves, but also for their family. And sort of this interconnectedness of care relations showed these histories of migration, community displacement, with the provision of security within this sort of insecure systems, core to the very idea of care. So just to round off, this kind of shows some future projects or current projects. So a current project looking at the infrastructures of care beyond kind of Southern Africa, but looking at Sub-Saharan Africa and trying to theorize it a bit more into what infrastructure means, what care means, and how we can start to use the ethics of care and infrastructures as analytical tools for the urban areas that older people are living in Sub-Saharan Africa, and trying to get a better concept of that. So that's funded by Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Aging, and it's a Research Excellence Award from the Oxford Brookes. And also part of small projects looking at healthy placemaking for older Africans in Oxfordshire, and trying to connect elements that I also identified within my research on transnational aging, and these connections of transnational communities and how we age, and the links particularly with areas that were colonized by the UK. And so I show some of recent sort of projects and intergenerational conversations within Oxfordshire to start to identify sort of how old people are caring for themselves, for their families, and what care means to them. And also these sort of workshops that allow sort of older people to develop aspects of digital storytelling, physical storytelling and digital storytelling. Okay, so I just thought I'd touch on that before I complete. So thank you very much.